So we have talked about some of our theoretical underpinnings, and in amongst there we talked about or threw in some fancy phrases like triadic model of language development and talked about and emphasized language. What we want to do now is go over that. And you may be thinking, this is AAC implementation. Why are we going to be talking about language? But hopefully through the course of this unit, you'll understand why. So there's a lot that we need to know in the sense of, in some ways, why individuals with complex communication needs are at a disadvantage. One thing is just there's a lot less verbal output oftentimes with these individuals, or their verbal output is harder to understand. And so unfortunately, through no malice or intention or anything like that, we tend to talk to individuals less. Researchers in the field, Hart and Risley in particular, have shown that we talk a lot to individuals who are typically developing, and they are constantly bombarded with words and phrases. And we also are seeing that this is not necessarily the case with individuals with complex communication needs. But why is this talking so important? If we need to think of it from a really technical and cognitive standpoint, there's this fancy term called the zone of proximal development, and that was developed by Vygotsky, and it's an understanding or a theory behind learning, and it really resonates with us. And I think we both, as parents and as communication partners, we realize that we do this all the time in our natural interactions. So what is it really? Well, when we have the zone of proximal development, we have an individual. That's me. And we have their communication partner, usually an adult or someone who has more language. And what happens is this individual says something, and this individual expands upon it. And what happens is that they move through this zone of proximal development, where an individual is taught more, essentially, by their communication partner through different kind of strategies. And they are obviously more competent, and so they are modeling something higher. And that's really what helps make this more directional in the sense of the individual is advancing. So it's really a fancy term for a process that, again, you're already doing. What we need to talk about is how do we do this for individuals with complex communication needs. And what becomes very different in our field is that it now evolves into that fancy term, the triadic model of language development, because it's not just about the individual and their communication partner, like we had in that graphic. It now becomes about the individual, their communication partner, and their AAC system. So it's a three-way process. So when we think about it, now let's bring this to Hillary. Desperate to be part of this. We have Hillary, and we have her communication partner. And so they typically would talk back and forth, and we would work through that zone of proximal development. But now what happens is the individual has a communication system as well. And so it has to be involved in this process. Because if our individual is going to learn how to communicate and communicate more effectively and in a more advanced manner, it's not going to happen unless this is involved. But she alone, and we will definitely talk more about this, but she alone cannot learn to use that system if it isn't involved in Hillary's work with her, in how she is modeling and doing and using the device in more advanced ways so that we can help her move through that zone of proximal development. So again, we're going to talk more and more about this, but something that's really important to understand, and what we've seen in our practice, is even individuals with the best intentions tend to revert to simpler kinds of communicative exchanges because the individual has less output that they're offering. And so we see individuals going to yes/no questions or forced choice questions because we can understand the answer. And it makes sense, but don't forget this three-way process and that zone of proximal development. If we're only doing forced choice or yes/no questions, we're not helping that individual move forward. We're in some ways even just staying and potentially even moving backwards in that way. So we have some fun rules or rules that we try to remind ourselves about that we wanted to share with you.
All right, are you guys ready?
We're ready.
Okay, so first, rule number 1, communication can be anything. It really can be anything. We're talking about our nonverbal communication, our facial expressions.
And it can be about anything. We don't necessarily know what an individual wants to communicate about, or even if they give us a word, what is it about that? So we have to be open to how it really is and can be and should be anything. It's limitless.
It's important to remember to speak for yourself. I know oftentimes we know that our student knows an answer or understands it, but we really need to make sure that we're not putting words into the other individual's mouth. Very important.
And it comes from the best intentions. You're itching, you see the moments being lost, and you see the individual struggling for something. But again, we don't know where it might go. And so we have to make sure that we empower the individual to share their message and to be an independent communicator. There is nothing more degrading in some ways as having someone constantly talk for you. And unfortunately, this pattern builds because their communication partner is more effective, and then the individual sees that it's easier just for them to say the message. And we really want to challenge the individuals with whom we work and their communication partners to try to avoid that.
And so 2 stories here. If you've ever interacted with a child, you know what they're going to say is never expected. So we can't be putting our expected communication, they may be talking about or going in a different route, like Narissa said. One thing that we've seen, and really one of my pet peeves, is when you're walking in the hall at a school or maybe at the mall with a student with complex communication needs, and someone walks up to them and they look at the communication partner, or they say, "Hey, hi, how are you?" and then look right at the communication partner versus the individual. So really, when we're speaking for someone else, that we're creating and enabling that. So really direct the communication partner back.
Yeah.
Narissa touched base on this already. Ask open-ended questions. So really making sure that we're not going to that straight yes and no, but tell me what you think, or tell me about what happened the other day.
Right.
One of my favorite. So Narissa has talked about how AAC is not speedy. We try to do our best to make it speedy, but we need to make sure that we're providing wait time. We're giving that opportunity for our individuals to initiate. So use wait time.
And we're definitely going to talk more about that when we talk about modeling and different modeling techniques. And this wait time is painful, and we still remind ourselves to count our Mississippis and to take our time. And on a few occasions when Hillary's been able to observe one of my sessions, she'll say, "Oh, I love what you're doing, except for stop jumping in so quickly." And having done this for years, I still struggle with the wait time. It's really hard, but it's so important.
Last but not least, we need to make communication happen. We need to create those opportunities, and that's a big, big piece of it.
And that's what we're going to really talk about as we move forward with this, is how do we create these opportunities? How do we set up an individual for successful communication with or without their AAC system? Because without the opportunities, none of this can happen. So a really important rule that we like to really emphasize.
All right, so you guys have the rules as communication partners, but now we need to back up and give some more information about language development. And so Roger Brown came up with the kind of the hierarchy, the progression of language development. And Pranky Ramick Company has a great resource out there, the Language Lab, that goes along with those developmental stages really nicely and outlining what the individual needs to be doing for language development and how that kind of goes with AAC or their AAC system.
So Roger Brown, he came up with 5 stages based on morphemes, which are the smallest unit of speech, or smallest unit of meaning, I'm sorry. And this lab is an extension upon that. They actually have 6 stages of language development, and so we're going to see what those are and how they relate to AAC use.
Let's go over the stages first, and then we'll talk about why that's really important to know. So when we look at the 6 stages, stage 1 uses, most of our individuals at this stage are requesting, and it's at the 1-word level.
And so they may be using single words to request something, as Hillary mentioned, or get basic needs met or direct another's behavior. So that 1 word can have multiple meanings, but it's typically just 1 word.
It's not associated with a certain age. We may have some AAC users that are on stage 1 and are older or younger, really focusing at where the student is at that moment. Stage 2, here's where we start to see more 2-word combinations. And we're starting to see it for requesting and maybe directing another person's interactions.
Okay.
Then we move on to stage 3, where we start to see more of those grammar rules kind of pulling in there. We look at ing at this stage, I believe.
So we have progressive ing, we have plural s. Again, the individual's using 2 to 3 word combinations, but starting to refine it, making their message a little bit more specific so their meaning is better understood.
Perfect. Stage 4, we're increasing the length of words that we're using to about 4 to 5. Continuing to progress on our grammar using specific pronouns and the expansion.
And we also see more use of questions and interrogatives and a better understanding of word order and how different word order can affect meaning, and flipping a statement into a question by shifting words around. And again, just more refinement. So constantly building on it. And it doesn't mean that every single phrase or sentence is 4 to 5 words in length. It means that they have, it is an indication of their extent of their vocabulary. But again, it's more about this refinement that happens. They're building on the skills.
And it's not that they have like 1 4-word sentence carrier phrase they're using, but they're understanding the linguistics kind of behind it.
Yep.
Stage 5, again, we're increasing our length of utterance using very specific language. We have our 3rd person pronouns here. What else am I forgetting for our stage 5?
Just continued increased refinement. And I think really it's hard to see a clear distinction between 5 and 6, especially as you get higher and higher up there. We can get fancy and people can start playing around with reflexive pronouns and things like that. But again, just understanding that there is a progression that goes from this single word into this combination, and then combination with refinement, and then also different communicative purposes. And so what could have been reflected in a single word, so cookie, could be a question such as, what is that a cookie, or whose cookie is that? And we as communication partners are interpreting that earlier on when an individual is using single or just 1 to 2 word combinations, whereas obviously as they advance, they're better able to generate a WH question or to use an interrogative to ask that and make their meaning known with less interpretation from us.
All right, so why do we need to know this? Are we quizzed on what stage is what, which one comes where? The importance of really understanding this is for modeling, right? We need to know where that student is, because as Nerissa talked about those zones of proximal development, we are adding to that individual's reach, right? Or their understanding, or expanding their abilities. So we're going to be modeling, let's say they're at a stage 2, so they're combining words. We're going to be modeling at that 2-word utterance level, but also modeling at the next level coming up.
Model up.
If we never model up, they're going to stay at this stage too. We want to continue through the progression. So we need to make sure that we know what that next stage is. We're incorporating that when we're modeling through the different strategies, the different language expectations.
I think something that's also important that we, or I forgot to mention, was that we also always have to assume competence. So even if an individual is presenting at a certain level, we have to have this in mind because we're always going to push them. We can never assume that someone who presents with a certain diagnosis and has X, Y, or Z communication system is going to stay at a certain level. They're constantly going to be growing and evolving, and it's our job to help that happen. So we are modeling up, it's one of our favorite phrases, and we're having a sense of where the individual can go because we're assuming that they can. So if we think about Mason, and we talked about how when he started, AAC was his primary mode of communication. Well, it's evolved into being very much a secondary mode, one that's only used to repair communication breakdowns or to conjugate verbs to show how fancy he is. If we hadn't had an idea of this is where we were going, we could have potentially stayed in there. One of my favorite stories about him is that we just did recent testing, and what he could do, we did it with or without using his AAC system, and what he showed us in terms of the complexity of his grammar and his linguistic understanding when we provided him access to the device blew our socks off. He was doing possessives and conjugating and doing past tense and future tense and present progressive and all that kind of stuff, which he wasn't able to verbalize at that time given his diagnosis of apraxia. So again, we cannot underscore enough that it feels like this doesn't apply in some cases, but we are here to urge you and encourage you to think of it does, because the individual is going to progress and they're going to move, and we need to know in which direction so we can be really systematic and help them through those stages.
And another important reasoning of this is, so with AAC, we said on our top of our iceberg we have the AAC tool, but we also need to make sure that they have access to vocabulary that's going to allow them to get to this stage. And so we'll talk a bit more about core vocabulary and kind of what that is, but this kind of really helps push us in that direction. I think we also need to talk about, we're talking about those stages moving forward. What do we need to know? Why do we need to know this for modeling pieces? But I think if we could go back to your kind of triadic model there.
Do you want me to draw it?
I think it would be helpful, yes.
All right.
So
talk me through this.
What we're talking about in that triadic piece, and so we need to know the stages so that we can incorporate it in our modeling. So we said that we have our individual with complex communication needs. Beautiful, beautiful. And then you have their communication partner.
You want it to be you?
Beautiful, beautiful. So now this individual has a communication device, so we need to bring that in, remember? So now we have that three-way communication piece of it. So for this example, let's say that the individual is at a stage 2 level, stage 2. So we know that they're using 2-word utterances, they're requesting, directing, starting to expand on their vocabulary. Perfect. So Nursa has that person saying dog go, eat cookie, one of my favorite things to do. And then as the communication partner, I have to model up, right? So I need to be thinking about that stage 3. So we're using maybe 2 to 3 word utterances. We're using some verbs, the word orders coming into play. We're using more specific language. The dog goes, I want, eat cookie. So that I'm modeling that because I know that that communication partner can do it. And I know that if I model it, they're going to have a better chance of getting there. So I'm going to be verbalizing it and using their AAC. So my communication is using the AAC as well as verbally to the individual. And so when they're communicating back to me, I'm expecting the same thing, that they're using that AAC device. We're having this 3-way conversation. Make sense?
Does. It's great.